It began as a day no one expected to remember. On December 14th, 2025, Hollywood seemed to lose its voice. The world awoke to heartbreaking news. Iconic filmmaker Rob Reiner and his wife of over 30 years, Michelle Singer Reiner, had been violently taken from life itself. The shocking homicide unfolded quietly inside their Brentwood home in Los Angeles, yet its impact echoed across the globe. That quiet was broken when family members made the devastating discovery later that afternoon. In a single moment, grief replaced disbelief. The tragedy revealed how unforgiving fate can be, reminding us that even those who spent a lifetime creating stories filled with warmth, hope, and humanity are not immune to darkness. Now, the films that once lifted spirits and spread joy carry a different weight. What were once symbols of laughter and love feel instead like a final goodbye, one the world was never ready to hear. Few filmmakers leave behind more than movies. Rob Reiner left behind a belief system. To the world, he was a giant of cinema. To those who knew him, he was a man who held tightly to fairness, family, and human dignity, values he never traded away, no matter the cost. What most people never saw was the quiet pain he carried for years. Behind the awards and applause, Rob Reiner lived with a private heartbreak, his son's long struggle with addiction. It was a slow-burning family tragedy, one he bore silently almost until his final days. Now, in a cruel and shocking twist, that same son has come under police suspicion in connection with the deaths of Rob Reiner and his wife. The revelation has sent a cold wave through the public, turning grief into disbelief. Before we go any further, please take a moment to leave a heart, a small sign of respect for an artist who gave his life to storytelling and leaves behind an echoing silence. On Sunday afternoon, December 14th, around 3:30 p.m., emergency services received a call from a home in Brentwood, a quiet neighborhood in West Los Angeles. When firefighters arrived, they found Rob Reiner, 78, and his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, dead inside their residence. Earlier that day had seemed ordinary. Sunlight slipped through tree-lined streets. The neighborhood stayed calm as it always did. Nothing felt out of place. No loud noises, no visible disturbance. Only later did it become clear that the silence inside the house had lasted far too long. Soon after, the Los Angeles Police Department took over. The couple was discovered inside the home they had long considered a safe haven from Hollywood spotlight. There were no broken windows, no forced doors, no signs that anyone had rushed in or fled the scene. Instead, investigators found something far more disturbing. Both victims had suffered stab wounds, injuries so serious that police stopped looking outside the home for answers and began examining the family itself. The case was handed to the LAPD's Robbery Homicide Division and officially listed as a suspected homicide, pointing clearly to criminal involvement, though no final conclusion had yet been reached. That evening, police spoke briefly to the public. They shared no new details, confirmed no suspects, and announced no clear theory. The investigation, they said, was ongoing. Their silence only deepened the unease, allowing the weight of the tragedy to grow heavier. The Reiner family followed the same path. In a short statement, they announced the devastating loss of Rob and Michelle Reiner and asked for privacy during this painful time. No explanations, no added words, just silence. Something Rob Reiner, a man who spent his life speaking through film and public dialogue, rarely chose for himself. At 78, Rob Reiner had nothing left to prove. His work had already outlived awards and rankings. Films like Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, and A Few Good Men had become part of everyday memory. People didn't love them for spectacle, but how real they felt, like stories pulled from their own lives. That may be why news of his death spread quietly. There was no noise, no frenzy, just a shared pause, as if many people stopped at the same moment to absorb the loss. Within a day, tributes began to appear. Former President Barack Obama described Reiner as a storyteller who helped America reflect on itself, not with slogans, but with deeply human truth. He once wrote that Rob Reiner understood America in a way only people who truly care ever do. To him, Reiner wasn't just observant, he was deeply invested. Gavin Newsom later described Rob as a steady, fearless voice, someone who never backed away from controversy. Nancy Pelosi remembered him as a storyteller who believed film and civic duty could never be separated. Inside the filmmaking world, the grief sounded softer, almost hushed. Aaron Sorkin reflected on working with Reiner on A Few Good Men, saying Rob showed him that real drama doesn't live in clever words, but in the pause right before someone speaks. Billy Crystal kept his tribute simple. Rob never pressured you as an actor. He inspired you to rise just by believing in you. Meg Ryan shared something just as personal, saying that being directed by Rob felt safe, a rare feeling on a movie set. When people talk about Rob Reiner, they don't list awards or box office totals. Instead, they remember the quiet things, how he stood behind the camera, how he lowered his voice to guide an actor towards honesty, then stepped back and trusted the story to breathe on its own. Throughout his career, Rob told stories about family, about flawed people holding on to one another, even as cracks slowly formed beneath the surface. The final chapter of his life ended without clear answers, and maybe it never needed them. Until the investigation is complete, the truth remains locked behind the Brentwood house. Still, one truth already stands firm. Rob Reiner did not leave this world as a symbol or a legend, but as a human being. That is why the silence he left behind feels heavier than any goodbye. And his passing does not end the story. Instead, it opens a hollow space. Inside that space, one name slowly comes into focus, not as an explanation, but as part of a tragedy that had been quietly burning for years. That name is Nick Reiner, his son. In the days after the tragedy, while the Brentwood home stayed sealed and investigators searched for clarity, the media attention began to shift. The focus moved away from films and legacy and towards a long, painful reality that had existed out of sight for years. Born in 1993, Nick is the second son of Rob and Michelle Reiner. From early on, he drifted away from the protection of a famous family and towards a life shaped by deep personal fractures. Nick's struggle with addiction began around age 15. What followed was never a straight path forward. Recovery was often interrupted by relapse. Periods of stability gave way to collapse. At times, he had no permanent place to live, moving from state to state, even experiencing homelessness, a life far removed from the public image of the Reiner name. He never tried to hide this reality. In the rare moments he spoke publicly, Nick admitted he felt lost, unable to find his place in a world where his last name was both a gift and a weight. In 2016, he shared his story openly for the first time in an interview with People. He wasn't asking for sympathy or offering excuses. He spoke honestly about addiction, about falling back after progress, and about his deepest pain. Not his own suffering, but the damage his struggles caused his parents. Rob Reiner was never distant from that story. He didn't try to direct it or control the outcome. Instead, he stood beside his son, not as a filmmaker shaping a narrative, but as a father who understood a hard truth. Some battles cannot be fought for your child, only with them. Out of pain and lived experience came Being Charlie, a semi-autobiographical film directed by Rob Reiner, drawn directly from Nick's real-life struggle. Instead of offering clear solutions or tying everything up neatly, the film chooses honesty over comfort. It follows a young teenager lost to addiction, a family left powerless, and a kind of love that exists but still falls short of saving someone. This was never meant to be a story of recovery. It was a confession laid bare on screen. For Rob and Michelle, Nick's battle never reached a dramatic turning point or a clean resolution. Their lives became a long season of waiting. waiting for small signs of progress, waiting for him to last a little longer than before. It was a quiet kind of suffering, stretched over years, ongoing and hard to even describe. That same history is what placed Nick Reiner's name under intense attention when tragedy struck. No official accusations were made, no public findings were released. Yet the silence from authorities, combined with what was already known, was enough for the media to revisit old stories. What had once been framed as a journey toward rebuilding was suddenly re-examined through a far more cautious lens. At this moment, police have not named Nick Reiner as a suspect. What exists instead is an open case and a man thrust into public view while the truth remains hidden. Nick has not spoken. He has not appeared. That silence offers no answers, but it reflects a familiar pattern. For much of his life, he existed away from the spotlight, even within his own family. And this may be the deepest sorrow Rob Reiner ever carried. Not the loss of success or recognition, but leaving this world knowing his child was still trapped, still searching for a way out. Time and again, Rob told stories about broken families, about people who care deeply for one another yet cannot rescue those they love. In the end, his real life quietly mirrored the themes of his work. To understand why the final chapter of Rob Reiner's story closed with so much left unsaid, one must look far earlier, back to a childhood lived beneath the shadow of a famous father admired by an entire nation. Rob Reiner entered the world already carrying a legacy. Born in 1947, he was the son of Carl Reiner, a man who was more than a comedian. He was a creative force who helped shape post-war American entertainment. Alongside collaborators like Mel Brooks, and through projects such as The Dick Van Dyke Show, Carl helped define an era, crafting humor that seemed light but stayed deeply rooted in the culture. Inside that home, Rob was never short on affection, opportunity, or support. What he lacked, however, was something harder to give: the freedom to exist without comparison. From the outside, his upbringing looked like pure luck. From the inside, it felt like a shadow that never quite lifted. From childhood onward, he was introduced not as Rob, but as Carl Reiner's son. Every achievement was weighed against his father's reputation. Every success was questioned for how much was earned and how much was inherited, and every misstep carried more weight than it would have for someone else. People assumed that the child of a legend should be extraordinary without effort. The burden wasn't hardship, it was the constant pressure to prove value even when success was already present. When Rob Reiner stepped into acting in the late 1960s, that pressure followed him. By 1971, he became a household name as Mike Meathead Stivic on All in the Family, a role he carried until the show ended in 1979. That single role turned him into a star. It made him popular, relatable, and a clear symbol of a younger generation, bold, outspoken, progressive, and unafraid to question old ideas. But success came with a hidden cost. Without meaning to, that character placed him inside a box. In 1970s Hollywood, Rob Reiner was still seen as a sitcom face, smart and witty, yes, but not someone trusted to carry bigger stories. So when he said near the end of the decade that he wanted to direct films, people laughed, not because they hated him, but because they didn't believe him. Years later, Rob would admit that this moment taught him something painful. Being liked, he learned, is very different from being trusted. People enjoyed watching me, he realized, but they didn't think I could lead from behind the camera. Still, Rob Reiner refused the easy path. Instead of staying where he was comfortable, he stepped straight into unfamiliar ground. From the very start, he accepted judgment and comparison. Then in 1984, This Is Spinal Tap arrived. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a clever joke, a playful mockumentary making fun of rock stars. But as audiences kept watching, something deeper became clear. Rob Reiner was quietly holding a mirror up to an industry that took itself too seriously. He didn't shout, he didn't explain the joke. He simply placed the camera where it belonged and let the absurdity speak for itself. After that, the films kept coming, one after another. Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, Misery, A Few Good Men. Each movie felt different, yet they all shared an invisible thread. What connected them wasn't scale or spectacle, but honesty. His characters were not written to feel heroic, they were written to feel real. Children were stubborn, scared, and vulnerable. Adults loved deeply, doubted often, and rarely knew if they were making the right choices. By then, Rob Reiner no longer needed to explain himself. He didn't argue with the people who once doubted him. His films spoke in his place. Slowly, Hollywood changed how it saw him. He was no longer introduced as Carl Reiner's son. He was no longer dismissed as a sitcom actor who wandered into directing. Instead, he became known as a filmmaker who listened to his characters, to small moments, to quiet truths. But Hollywood rarely holds space for anyone forever. By the late 1990s, the atmosphere shifted. A new generation arrived. Styles changed. Audiences wanted something different. Rob Reiner's leader films no longer received the same attention. There was no dramatic fall, no scandal, no headline-grabbing failure. Nothing exploded. Things simply grew quieter. The phone rang less. Invitations came later, if they came at all. He slowly realized he was no longer the name people waited for before starting a meeting. He kept making films, careful films, thoughtful films, but they passed through theaters gently, without much noise. People didn't argue about them, they didn't hate them, they just didn't rush toward them either. It was a specific kind of silence. Not the sound of a door slamming shut, but the feeling of a door no longer being held open. For Rob Reiner, being forgotten didn't feel like rest. It felt like leaving a room once felt like home while the light stayed on, but no longer shined his way. Later, he explained it simply. Nothing collapsed, it just went quiet, and somehow I was outside. After 2000, his career didn't explode into a new chapter. Instead, it slowed in a very human way. He continued to work, but no longer at the center of attention. There were no films that made Hollywood stop and watch, just smaller projects that arrived softly and left the same way. Rob didn't vanish, but he also didn't fight his way back to the top at any cost. In interviews, he spoke calmly about filmmaking, like someone who had already traveled far enough to stop proving himself. He became a storyteller who had stepped back one pace, watching cinema evolve, watching younger voices rise, and accepting that his place was now part of a past that still mattered, even if it no longer demanded the spotlight. In that quiet space, he seemed clearer as a person. He wasn't chasing the times, and he wasn't resisting them either. He stayed grounded in what he believed in: family, memory, and the understanding that not every chapter of a life needs a dramatic ending to feel complete. And as he stepped further away from the center of cinema, the public began seeing him differently. Starting around 2016, as Donald Trump entered the White House and the country grew deeply divided, Rob Reiner became one of the loudest and most consistent opposing voices in Hollywood. He didn't soften his words, he didn't hide his views. He spoke directly and without compromise. To some, that honesty felt brave. To others, it felt polarizing. And slowly, Rob Reiner was no longer known first as a filmmaker. He became, instead, a voice, one closely tied to the political arguments of his time. Inside corporate offices and creative circles, his name never truly vanished, but it was no longer welcomed with the same ease. Not because his talent had faded, but because of what he had come to symbolize in a divided cultural moment. Still, Rob Reiner never turned his movies into political megaphones. He never reshaped his earlier work to satisfy the mood of the times. Yet his public image slowly pulled those films into debates they were never meant to enter. Stories that once reached people purely through feeling were now judged through new lenses. Art was no longer allowed to stand on its own. And the real loss was not that Rob Reiner spoke his mind. The loss was the growing gap between the storyteller and the audience. That distance didn't arrive through open conflict, but but through hesitation. Quietly, carefully, people stepped back. The films remained, unchanged and powerful, but the voice behind them was no longer heard the same way. And then came the moment no amount of experience could prepare him for. In 2020, Rob Reiner passed away at 98. To the world, it marked the end of an era. To Rob, it was something far more personal. It was the first time in his life he stood without the man who had always stood behind him, the one who protected him, shaped him, and never stopped believing in him. Sometimes present in plain sight, sometimes steady in the background. After the funeral, Rob admitted that he felt truly orphaned even in his 70s, not because he lacked love or support, but because the one person who made him feel complete without proving anything was gone. And with that loss, he was forced to stand fully alone at an age when most people have already leaned into certainty. Looking back, Rob Reiner's story was never about failure. He succeeded so deeply that his work became part of America's shared memory. But he lived on a thin line between praise and pressure, admiration and skepticism, long applause and long silences when his name was not spoken at all. He told stories about flawed families, about people who loved deeply yet couldn't always save one another, not because it made for good cinema, but because it reflected a truth he understood firsthand. And that's how this story ends, without neat answers, without a perfect resolution. Just a life lived between brilliance and quiet shadows, shaped by love that could never be replaced. Rob Reiner leaves behind more than iconic films. He leaves a deeply human legacy, one about family, devotion, and the unspoken pains that follow even the brightest lives. If this story gave you pause, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing so we can continue exploring the real lives behind Hollywood's shining lights. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.